Dave, 1996 is one hell of a year for WCW. It's one hell of a year for professional wrestling. From Scott Hall coming in to Kevin Nash coming in to them powerbombing Eric Bischoff through the stage at the Great American Bash, the Hogan heel turn in July, Giant, DiBiase, Sean Waltman all joining the NWO, Eric Bischoff turning heel toward the end of the year, Roddy Piper coming in. The Roddy Piper arrival we can take all the way back to our WrestleMania 1 chat in terms of its historical significance as he faces off with Hulk Hogan in a long-delayed, simmering tension feud. But before we get to that, we got to get to the NWO. Those three letters in 1996. I want to start by asking you, when did you realize the NWO angle would change the business?
I don't know. I'm trying to remember, like, I may have the poster here because I can remember a conversation with Eric Bischoff. I don't have the poster any longer, but it was the World Wrestling Peace Festival.
Ah, yes.
Okay, so that's, I don't even remember what month that is, but I think it was actually before, it may have been before Hogan joined, but I remember having the conversation with Eric Bischoff that it was going to be, that this was going to be a gigantic angle. I also remember thinking, at the time he said, do you think that, it was kind of joking about how it was using Vince's billionaire Ted stuff against him, which I thought was very clever at the time. And that's part of the reason that it worked so well. And I remember him going like, do you think we can keep it till the end of the year? And I was thinking, I think you can blow it off at the end of 97. That's how strong it is. And as it turned out, they never blew it off.
They sure didn't. They went down with it.
Yeah, they went up with it and they went down with it. But I do remember that conversation, right away. So I thought it was going to be really, really big pretty quick, I think, from really the not the Hall debut. The Hall debut I thought was, it was big, but guys jumped all the time, right? It's like, a lot of guys jumped. Luger jumped, who was as big a star as Hall at the time, if not bigger. But when Nash jumped and they did the idea, and the idea was that it was the WWE coming to face WCW, doing that interpromotional feud that people wanted and never saw. I thought that was like guaranteed big. Now with Hogan, and it was a lot bigger. I mean, I can't say I thought it was going to be as big as it was, but I did think it was going to be really big.
Now, with that aforementioned feeling of it being big and the interpromotional aspect to it, it was interesting because that became a legally delicate matter. The WWF would actually sue WCW for representing that they were actually in concert. So that's a place that Eric Bischoff, for instance, and looking back on history, refuses to go. The idea that that was the theme he was presenting, though I think anybody watching week to week very clearly understood that was the case.
Well, that was what you wanted the people to believe. You didn't have to go out and say it. And where they made mistakes is on their hotline. They outright said it, and they had no right. You could do it without saying it, and everybody was thinking it, but you don't have to actually say it. And they said they were the NWO, which came later. Right away at the very beginning, they didn't say who they were,
right?
And they didn't really give them a name, but. I thought that the idea that that's what you're presenting without saying, hey, we're actually coming from WWE, because, then it becomes a legal matter. They made some mistakes early on that, hurt them in court.
So did anything come of the court tiff? I don't believe there was any kind of a settlement or monetary exchange, or was there?
God, there was absolutely a settlement.
Okay, so they forked over cash then?
I don't know, like that's all sealed. I don't know, but
right.
they definitely, there was definitely a settlement in that case. Yeah. Because that settlement, part of that settlement had to do with Vince, not Vince getting the company, but there was something in that settlement that led to Vince being the first person they talked with when they were trying to get rid of the company, and then that. If you remember, a couple of years later, it fell through because they were on Spike at the time.
Yeah.
And TBS at the time wanted to keep wrestling, and Vince was going to buy it and keep it on TBS because TBS still wanted to keep it. And that fell through because Spike said, no, you've got a contract. We'll sue if you put your wrestling on something else. And Vince tried to go, no, it's going to make everything stronger if I can have my wrestling on that station. They said, no, we're paying you $28 million a year for exclusivity. Exclusivity doesn't mean you go on a rival network. And so that's what killed the original deal. And then that's when Bischoff came in with a later deal. And then that deal fell through because then TBS had a new person in charge who didn't want wrestling. So then they went back to Vince. And, and then Eric couldn't save it at that point because he didn't have enough time to save it.
Wow. And so looking a bit ahead here in our Starrcade journey as WCW circles the drain and some panic moves are made, but these are the halcyon days. These are the salad days, 1996. Dave, is the NWO the greatest angle in the history of the business?
No, because of the end result, I can't say that it was. I guess I'm going to say, if you're talking about the greatest angle that drew the most money, you kind of got to go with something to do with Steve Austin.
Mm-hmm.
Because, whether it was Vince McMahon and Steve Austin probably, because they won. I mean, the NWO was a short-term win and a long-term loss. So in the long run, I would have to say no. It was a gigantic angle that changed business. So the 96, 97 was one of the biggest angles ever, but then it got too long and it backfired, I suppose. And so it backfired because they never gave back, and they destroyed the WCW brand by making it uncool while doing this angle. So they made it started out great, but they made a lot of mistakes in as it was going up. They made mistakes which caused it to go down.
Now here at the 96 Starrcade, Hogan and Piper face off again in the main event. Piper puts Hogan asleep with the sleeper hold and loses to him clean. Piper rather beats Hogan clean. First of all, Dave, was it a big deal at the time that Piper had jumped from New York? That was apparently something that had been negotiated and talked about back when they were in acquisition mode under, I think, Jim Herd, and a lot of guys were getting offers like Savage and Hart, but for some reason there was a feeling that Piper wasn't going to go. When he went, did it feel like a big shot across the bow?
I think it was huge. It was absolutely huge because it was, to me, like when I look at the 80s, it's hard to say like who was bigger, Piper or Savage. I mean, because I guess really Savage may have been bigger, but I always considered them like kind of at the same level. But Piper, Piper I think was more important, or that I'll say without a doubt, because WrestleMania 1 was far more important than WrestleMania 4 or 5, even though those were, it was bigger and they were more established. But the WrestleMania 1 was the one where, it's the sink or swim one. If that one went south, everything would be different. By 4 and 5, it was the die was already cast. So I consider Roddy Piper, except for Hogan, the most important character in the growth of WWF. And where Savage was always around, Piper was usually gone. So I thought that, like, in a sense, that it made Piper more valuable. So I thought it was a pretty big deal, and I know that WWF was not happy about that one. I think that they thought that Roddy was someone who was going to stay loyal to them, and I know that one hurt. I know because I remember talking to people when it happened, and they were not expecting it, and they were hurt because Roddy had been with them, and even when he wasn't around, they were whatever is paying him a retainer or whatever, he was under a deal. But I guess it wasn't a contract, and so they just thought he would never go, and then he went. So they were, that was a surprise.
Now he cuts a promo on Hogan upon his WCW debut at the tail end of Halloween Havoc 96 after Hogan beats Savage in a title match. Savage kind of disappears for a few months. Piper comes out in Vegas, cuts a promo on Hogan. The lines among them are, they would not have loved you so much if they didn't hate me so much. To what degree are they leveraging kind of this long loose end between these two? Because as we've discussed in our WrestleMania chats, Dave, there never came that time when Hogan collected that Roddy Piper scalp. He never got that win, and that was played up big time in Piper's WCW debut.
Right, and Roddy certainly in the long run turned out to be smart for it because it made that feud valuable. And then to get Roddy to do it, Hogan had to lose the first one because Roddy wasn't going to. I don't think Roddy would have. I think Roddy was willing to lose to people, and then later in WCW he lost to a lot of people, maybe more. I don't want to say more than he should have, but maybe more than he should have. But he was. I think that Roddy, even at that point, knew. Which is, it sounds so funny talking about it now because wins and losses mean nothing. I mean, it's almost like a discussion of the Survivor Series where you talk about this, and I just think people listening are just going like, it's fake. What are they worrying about wins and losses? But it was
the reason it's huge.
Yeah, it was more. It's what made the business so big. But and the fact that it doesn't matter is one of the reasons why it's such a niche thing, I think, right now. But yeah, I think that the only way Hogan could get Roddy to lose to him was for Hogan to go down clean as a sheet the first time, so it would be the 1-on-1 situation. Because I think Roddy always felt that as long as he didn't lose to Hogan, he could always, he had another run. And Roddy, as funny as it was, because there was a lot of heat with Roddy never losing to Hogan when they wanted him to in the 80s, it gave, in the long run, it was far more valuable for Roddy, and Roddy stayed stronger than, look at all the guys, even like an Orndorff who drew all kinds of money with Hogan. By this point, what did Orndorff mean compared to Roddy Piper?
Right.
Orndorff, Orndorff, there was anyone clamoring in 1986 for another Hogan-Orndorff match? No. Not at all. Savage, to a degree, yes. But, the Savage thing, there was the Elizabeth stuff, and, there was a lot of unfinished business there on that one where, there was something there. But with Roddy, it was all a matter of wins and losses. And it was still big. And, Hogan and Roddy did big business by WCW standards at the time.
Certainly did. And Piper sort of overperformed to my memory. I remember there being this feeling that he wouldn't really be able to go, and he certainly wasn't, any kind of speed demon in the ring or anything like that. But on the mic and in the ring, I felt like he did a lot better than one would have expected. He showed up in shape. He was on point. And it was a time before people had grown tired of his rambling, nonsensical promos, bless his soul. And it was money that he would just rant on and ramble on, and he did well enough in the ring. Do you remember sort of being impressed by how he upped his game, or was it just Roddy?
Well, at that point, he was still Roddy, so it wasn't so much. It was a couple of years later when he started to fade that, you maybe look back on it. I mean, the one thing about it, like you said, was he showed up in great shape, and I was very impressed with that. He was Roddy was born in 54, so he's like 42, and he was really in by this point he's really in good shape. And 42, as wrestlers go, that's not really that old. A couple of years later when he became old, he really wasn't old Roddy Piper yet. He was getting there. A couple of years later, I think people kind of started seeing him as old Roddy Piper, but he was still enough of Roddy Piper, and it had been. It hadn't been that long. It wasn't really a nostalgia run. I didn't think it was still a strong run. I mean, he wasn't a nostalgia act yet. He became, I think, in time, because they used him so much and because he moved down the card, where he kind of faded and became kind of like the nostalgia act that wouldn't leave at the end, where there, and wasn't performing all that well later. But I think at this point it was still. God, Roddy Piper's back. This is a big deal. I mean, it's like WCW's hot. They're bringing back all the good stuff from the 80s, and the 80s was very big for wrestling, and it was remembered very well, and Vince was, Vince hadn't turned it around yet, and WCW had all the stars.
There was a money dynamic here between Hogan and Piper, further illustration of some things we've been talking about in charting kind of the Eric Bischoff tenure in WCW and cutting these big checks, where there was a few more years of mileage and drawing power left in superstars Vince McMahon had ushered in under his banner than he wanted to see. That he'd put them out to pasture prematurely, and they went to WCW and made money, including this show. They did at one point, tickets for Starrcade 96 reached $200, which was unheard of at the time, as you reported. Great live crowd, $113,000 gate, $60,000 in merchandise sales as the NWO merchandise exploded. It seems like, Dave, by the end of 1996, not only did the NWO feel like a hot angle and the TV ratings reflected it, but the money was coming in and the books were transforming dramatically.
Well, 96 was an absolute turnaround year, because I remember in 95, Nitro started in 95, and one of the first Nitros, not like the first one, but maybe a month in or 2 months in, they did a Georgia show with Hogan against Sting, and I just remember that it was like, it wasn't that big of a deal. You know, and I was thinking Hogan and Sting's going to be a big deal. Now, of course, Hogan and Sting later, people don't even remember that match. Later, of course, Hogan and Sting was gigantic. But it was like, it wasn't that big. But from January 96, which was really the Flair and Savage stuff, and through the Hogan stuff with Savage and Hogan and Piper and the NWO coming in, I mean, this was a company that completely turned around. I mean, it was, you know, I mean, WWF kind of had to turn around a couple of years later, but this was like, you know, one of the great turnarounds in pro wrestling history, you know, of a company. It was on the way. It got bigger in 97 and still grew in 98 before the, you know, but 96 was really the year that they went from being what they had been throughout the 90s, which was this struggling promotion that was, you know, having hard time selling tickets, you know, had a television audience, but not a big one, you know, to where it was, you know, at this point, when we're talking about Starrcade 96, this is a hot company that's about to get hotter.
And how much is Vince McMahon sweating in 1996?
Let me think about Vince McMahon.
He would have signed Brett to the 20-year deal in November, if that says anything.
So, well, that tells you that's right. Okay, so I would say Vince really started sweating not when Nash came, but very shortly after. If I can figure it, maybe when Nitro went 2 hours and Hall and Nash were together, and then all of a sudden they were losing in the ratings every week.
Mm-hmm.
Or they were winning most weeks, or it was dueling even, and it's kind of like, well, ratings aren't that important. We're dueling even, but we're killing them in house shows. Now all of a sudden they're selling tickets to house shows, which they never had before, and now they're beating you in the ratings every week. He was certainly sweating by the summer, absolutely.
Now Bischoff turns heel before this Starrcade 96 is sort of a key twist in the Roddy Piper angle. And it's before Vince McMahon had showed us the real potential and money-drawing ability of that heel authority figure character, I should say, a full year later after the departure of Bret Hart. When Bischoff turned heel, despite being the shoot executive vice president behind WCW, did any part of you feel like that was ill-advised?
Yeah, I thought it was, I mean, I thought that the guy running the company should be a babyface and against them as opposed to something with them. I didn't think it really made sense. With hindsight, I probably have a different opinion because it worked out. But yeah, when he first did it, I thought, oh, you know, they're hot and he's just trying to jump on board. But, you know, Eric really was a great heel character. I mean, so I wish that there was a strong character on the other end to counteract him. Like, you know, they brought in Harvey Schiller once or twice, but you know, he wasn't a weekly character. Mm-hmm. And I think that they, you know, like WCW needed, and that was the problem with the NWO angle in the sense that WCW never came off strong. They came off like this bumbling company that was like, you know, uncool, and all the cool guys were on the other side. I think that the NWO could have been what they were, kind of like when the Four Horsemen. The Four Horsemen were cool and everything, but there was no Dusty Rhodes on the other side. You know, that baby face, because Sting was, you know, again, at this point, Sting was out a lot.
Yeah.
And quiet. And Sting was never a great talker anyway. You needed that guy, and they weren't going to let Flair be that guy. He could have been, but you needed more backup, and you needed to keep it. It needed to be like an even thing as opposed to like a really one-sided feud. And at the beginning, you know, the heels had to go over, without a doubt. You know, at first, when the heels were going over all the time, I was like, you know, hey, that's what you got to do. You got to build heat. But then there was time to come back, and I don't think that they ever came back. And they also, the way the portrayal of WCW ended up being very damaging to the brand, because at the time when WCW was on fire, there was no brand loyalty to WCW. And that hurt them because it was very easy when the thing ran its course for it to just go down really fast.
Couple more notes on Starrcade 96 on some other participants in the show. We see Ultimo Dragon versus Dean Malenko to unify the J Crown. Everybody remembers at this point in time Ultimo Dragon, so iconic with those 8 belts. Tell our listeners what's the story.
Wasn't it like 9 or 10?
Oh, maybe. Could have been 9 or 10.
He had 8 from Japan, and then he had the 9th one, which was the WCW belt.
Okay, so he added to the collection then, right, to unify the WCW title with the J Crown.
I think he ended up getting a 10th, but I'm not sure on that one. But he definitely had 9. I thought the Ultimo Dragon Dean Malenko opening match at that Starrcade was
Excellent.
one of the greatest opening matches on a pay-per-view in history. I mean, right up, and it's one that's forgotten. I thought, like people always remember Brett and Owen, and rightly so. But I thought Ultimo Dragon and Dean Malenko was, I mean, I remember watching that. When I watched that match, I thought, these are the two best wrestlers in the world. And I'm not saying they were, but I'm saying when that match was over, that's how good it was. That I was going like, man, they were so technically fantastic and clicked so well. It was just awesome.
Yeah, it was absolute perfection in terms of placement, timing, execution. It played like a video game in a lot of ways. There was just no margin of error, no down second in the match where what they were doing didn't make sense or seemed like it was in a holding pattern. So tell our listeners, Dave, if you could, the story behind the J Crown and how Ultimo Dragon came to WCW with all that hardware. What's the story of that title?
Okay, so in August of '96, they had a tournament in Tokyo. And it was actually organized by Jushin Liger, and it was different champions from Mexico, the UK, and a lot of Japanese wrestlers all got together, and they all had different lighter weight championship belts, middleweight, whatever, middleweight, junior heavyweight, light heavyweight, and they came in, and there was an 8-man tournament that I was at in Tokyo, single elimination. So it was awesome because what you had was like you would have these matches on day one. You had 4 matches, and every one of those 8 guys in those matches all had a national or world championship from a different organization. When titles meant a lot, so it wasn't like Tom, Dick, and Harry titles. Although a couple of the titles were a little bit like that, but a lot of those titles were pretty major belts that had been significant in different versions in Japan. So you would have the 2 champions face each other, and the winner would get 2 belts. So in every match on the first night, everyone came out with 2 belts. Then in the semifinals, you got the 2 guys who ended up with 4 belts, who I believe were, was it Dragon and Sasuke?
Was it El Samurai in there? Or am I thinking of Super Junior?
El Samurai was in the tournament, absolutely. Yeah. Otani was in the tournament. Jushin Liger was in the tournament. But I believe the final was Sasuke and Ultimo Dragon. It was an absolutely fantastic match. And I believe, God, I don't remember. Did Sasuke win and then lose the title to Dragon?
Are we talking 1995, Dave? I see it.
Was it? I think it was 96.
Because I got a Super J Cup from '95 where Liger beats Ghetto.
Okay, that's a Super J Cup. That's different. This is the tournament was at the G1 Climax in August of '96. So if you look up those August shows at Sumo Hall, because I was at all. It was like 7 straight nights of Sumo Hall or 6 straight nights. It was so awesome. And this tournament, so that's the tournament, and it'll have like all the different champions that you had. But it was something to see. Not every match was great, but man, there were some great matches, and the final was fantastic. And then I believe Sasuke won, and then Dragon beat Sasuke to win all the belts. But maybe Dragon won. I'd have to look it up.
Wow. So that was nicely leveraged, I would say, by WCW.
So then he comes into WCW, and he's got all those belts and wins the WCW belts as well.
Right. And it was quite a presentation of the cruiserweights in 1996, a real breakthrough concept coming to the forefront for Eric Bischoff, and part of what made Nitro such an easy and an exciting watch back in those days, not just the NWO, but the cruiserweights as well.
Well, that's the one thing. That's, again, one of the reasons that they beat Vince so badly at first was because they were so ahead of the game. Vince was so stuck in this style of wrestling. And these guys came in with the Japanese and with the Mexicans that were just way ahead of the curve. And I just remember like going places where people would go like, because the shows were on head to head, and just friends of mine that were, in those days, unlike now, people who weren't wrestling fans were watching wrestling. I guess they were wrestling fans, but there were so many more than, there was anywhere from 9 to 12 million of them watching, not, 3.5. And the thing that I would always hear is like, you watch 2 shows and one is so much faster than the other, and you had all those guys, and until they ruined like the credibility of those guys, that was like people had never seen Rey Mysterio, who was a huge part of it. and even Ultimo Dragon type of guys. That was a way ahead of what we'd been seeing. We didn't get Jushin Liger week in and week out. We got him as a special guy every now and then. We didn't have those kind of high flyers that like people will see guys like that every week now, on various TV. Then it was new and fresh, and people were, their minds were blown by Rey Mysterio and Juventud Guerrera and Psychosis and these type of people. And Dean Malenko deserves all the credit in the world for acclimating them into an American style, because it wasn't a pure lucha that some people wouldn't have got. And it was that other aspect of WCW along with the NWO and the bringing back of the old stars of the 80s and just the whole package. I mean, the 3-hour Nitro, you saw so much. You look back, there was so much talent and so many good promos. I mean, nobody ever had the talent base that WCW had during that era, I don't think, in history.
The J-Crown tournament for history's sake here. Sasuke beats Motegi, and then Samurai beats Gran Hamada. And then Dragon beats Liger, Otani beats Negro Casas. So it's Sasuke versus El Samurai and Dragon versus Otani, leading to the final of Sasuke beating Ultimo Dragon in 1356 in a fantastic match.
The semifinals and finals were fantastic, and then Dragon came back and beat Sasuke.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And then they had to start giving back the belts, and it kind of just people forgot about it.
Go ahead, Dave.
But during that, I mean, that was again, nothing like that had ever happened in wrestling history, where you had like world champions, and every now and then you might have this unification match, but nobody had ever held 8 belts. I mean, just the idea, that was huge in Japan. And then it was I don't know if it was huge in the United States as much as, just walking to the ring with all those belts was something nobody had ever seen in the United States either.
Yeah, it made an indelible impression, even if you didn't know what the story behind the belts was. And of course, Mike Tenay did his best to explain it, but really captivating.
And one of the things, which was another thing that probably made WWF very unhappy, was one of those belts was the WWF light heavyweight belt that Vince McMahon's father gave to...
Fujinami had it, didn't he, at one point?
For years. Yeah. No. That's the WWF Junior. The WWF Junior belt. Fujinami had. No, this was the WWF light heavyweight belt that Perro Aguayo and Gran Hamada used to fight over.
In Mexico.
Right. And Villano 3 had it, and Benoit had it, and people like that. But that belt was one of the belts, was the WWF light heavyweight belt that was in the J Cup. So WCW had a WWF belt on its television, which didn't make WWF happy. And that I don't know if they sued over it, but I know that they never called it the WWF belt for that reason.
Right. And finally, on Starrcade 1996, of all that cruiserweight excitement generated that year, and you mentioned Rey Mysterio, he sort of rose even above that fray, and as we know, went on to have a wonderful career in the business. In 1996, here at Starrcade, he faces Jushin Liger on the show, had made his debut against Dean Malenko at Great American Bash. Quickly, Dave, what did Mysterio do for WCW in 1996, and what did he do for really the image of what a superstar could look like, be like, wrestle like?
He changed the game completely. I mean, we're talking in December against Jushin Liger. That was like a dream match. Jushin Liger was the great flyer of the what would it be, the early 90s, because Jushin Liger really hit it big. I'd say I think he debuted 89 at the Tokyo Dome, and then by 90 he was like the king, the first, and he had come to the United States with the matches with Brian Pillman and some other matches where American fans knew who he was, and he had the cool costume and everything. He could have been a real superstar here, and WCW didn't really get it, unfortunately. I thought he could have been like Moskris was in a generation earlier, the masked attraction, you would come in and everything like that. But you got to protect him, and they didn't know how to protect him. But still, he was still a legend, and Ray was even much smaller than Liger. I mean, when Ray came in, nobody of that size had ever been pushed in pro wrestling history in the United States. I mean, maybe 100 years ago, but I mean, modern pro wrestling history, most guys were a lot bigger than him. And I think to a lot of people, it was a joke seeing a guy that small on TV. But when you watch...
Including half the locker room.
Well, the first day... Okay, so the first day stories. This is in the summer when he comes in. And Bischoff has seen him once at the show that I mentioned, the World Wrestling Peace Festival. Bischoff had signed Rey Mysterio but and had heard good and bad about Rey Mysterio. So he saw him for the first time, and I just remember him coming up and just goes, "That size works for him." Everyone was telling me that the size is like a negative. I mean, he's great, but he's too small. It's like the whole reason he's so good is because he's so small. I mean, because you watch the way he worked, he used it to his advantage. So Eric was sold right away. So he comes in, and his first match is with Malenko, and he walks in the dressing room, and you've got all these, guys that are, all these big muscle guys like Lex Luger and Hulk Hogan and, even, guys that have been around the business forever. And they see this guy who's 5'2", even though they say he's taller. He was a little over five, just a shade over 5'2", and probably at that point, maybe 140.
Wow.
I'm trying to remember. The first time I met him, he told me his weight was 136. So this is probably a couple of years later. So maybe he's 145 at this point. Mm-hmm. But nobody like that's ever been in the business. And he goes in there, and they're all snickering behind his back. And him and Malenko tear the house down. And, he won everyone over. And, I mean, there was nobody who didn't respect Rey Mysterio. I mean, I remember when Flair worked with Rey Mysterio in a singles match, and I watched Flair bounce around for him with no problem. Which, like, when he first would have seen the guy like that, I don't think he would have done that.